that shows both the individual benefits of doing citizenship education and the societal benefits. And when citizenship education is done really well, it gives young people a vested interest.
皆様ごきげんよう、高松菜奈です。本日は主権者教育について考えたいと思います。ゲストはジェームス・ワインバーグさんです。ジェームスさんは主権者教育の研究をされ、現在イギリスのシェフィールド大学の政治行動学の講師をされています。本日は若者の政治参加や主権者教育の最新の研究についてお伺いできればと思っております。ジェームスさん、よろしくお願いします。
Hello,
Hello.
nice to meet you. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you very much. では、自己紹介をまずお願いします。
Of course,
Please,
yes.
James.
My name is Dr. James Weinberg. I'm an academic at the University of Sheffield in the UK. For the best part of a decade, I've been studying how we can strengthen modes of civic education and the teaching of politics in schools. And I also started my career as a secondary school teacher in London. Is that enough?
なぜ今、シティズンシップ教育が大事だと思いますか？
Well, I think teaching young people about politics and citizenship has always been important. But in the current moment, what we see is a world that's been beset in the last kind of 20 years or so by a number of critical junctures, the last of which, the COVID-19 pandemic, will require a global community of active citizens to come up with solutions that are going to help everyone to move forward. We can no longer rely on the old style of politics that we've become used to, both in democracies and non-democratic states. And the very purpose of citizenship education is to facilitate that process. So by teaching young people democratic values and skills and a whole host of knowledge about how their systems work, we can engage them in that process of democratic development and hopefully move towards a brighter future. And when citizenship education is done really well, it gives young people a vested interest in being part of the community, both locally and nationally, that they are living within. And it gives them the skills, even more importantly, to make an active contribution as well. And I'm sure in this discussion, we might go into exactly how that's done or why and when it's most effective. But in essence, that's the real purpose of good citizenship education done well.
主権者教育のどのような研究をされ、何が明らかになったのか、簡単に教えてください。
Well, I'll tell you maybe a little bit about the latest research I did. So, in the last year, I ran some large survey work with schools in England and surveyed about 3,300 secondary school teachers working in about 2,000 schools in England. And the purpose of that research was to try and provide a snapshot of what kinds of citizenship education are happening in schools, how they're being delivered, and also what are some of the barriers to them being done well. So I found that actually 25% of schools in England were offering absolutely no provision when it came to teaching citizenship education or politics. And that should be concerning because actually there are statutory responsibilities governing schools to be teaching politics either in a discrete session of citizenship education or through other means. And in 25% of schools, that wasn't happening. But where it was happening, I found that there were lots of different ways of doing politics and doing citizenship education that not only included individual lessons, but also included active learning projects that took place across the curriculum. There were community-oriented learning activities where students would couple up with organizations or companies in the community to learn about how politics and local resources are used. And within schools, there were extracurricular debating societies, there were visits by politicians, there were student trips to local council buildings and parliament. And all of these contribute to what we might call a culture of democratic education or culture of democracy in a school. The unfortunate thing being that actually there were very few schools where more than one of these things was happening, and even fewer schools where they were happening consistently. So there is a big a kind of a big recommendation arising from that research that we do need to be thinking better about how we govern the teaching of politics and citizenship in schools so that it does happen consistently and in a wider array of schools. So that was the big headline finding.
主権者教育の重要性が、日本ではなかなか社会全体で合意形成が取れていないと私は思うんですけども、科学的なエビデンスはありますか？
That partly depends what you mean by scientific, but I can certainly say there is a huge amount of survey research and interview research with young people, both cross-sectional and longitudinal, that shows both the individual benefits of doing citizenship education and the societal benefits. So the individual benefits being that those young people demonstrate increased knowledge about their national political systems. They tend to have more democratically oriented values, so they're more supportive of the systems of democracy in which they live. And they tend to be more engaged, so they're more likely to vote when they reach voting age, and they're more likely to be involved in their local communities in a civic oriented way as well. So some big benefits there that we can point to in existing research. For society itself, again, I would go back to the fact that if you have a society where all age groups are participating equally and all social groups are participating equally, then the kinds of policy that you make are responsive to a broader palette of your population, and therefore the nation will tend to be more successful, more opportunities, more development.
近年イギリスでは若者の政治参加が活発化しているように見えるんですけども、それは政治教育と関係がありますでしょうか？
So that's a really good question, and teasing out cause and effect is obviously extremely difficult. What we do know is that citizenship education was introduced onto our national curriculum in 2002. So from 2002 onwards, every young person aged 11 to 16 was supposed to receive some citizenship education every week. Now, let's assume that has happened in some form or another. Then we might expect that generation to have grown up being more politically active as a consequence of being taught about politics and power and participation. So we could say theoretically there should be a link there, or at least we see a strong correlation there. But on the flip side as well, we've seen some big political moments in the UK in the last 10 years that have spoken directly to young people's interests. The referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union being a particularly critical moment, because obviously lots of young people were enjoying the freedom of movement that membership of the EU gave them, the ability to live, work, and love in all the other states of the European Union, and that was taken away. But the fight and the campaign around that certainly invigorated lots of young people. So I think what we see is probably a little bit of cause and a little bit of correlation. Young people being better equipped to engage in politics because they've had this education at school, but also politics speaking more to young people's interests.
効果的なシティズンシップ教育の事例を教えてください。
So in the UK, England and Wales especially, I forgot to mention that we have the Her Majesty's Inspectorate, Ofsted, which inspects qualities and standards of schooling and education in each school. And part of what it will look for are any breaches of impartiality or the teaching of sensitive and controversial issues in a non-balanced way. And I think if you have that third-party regulator who is inspecting schools regularly to make sure that they are in line with the law, as well as providing really high-quality education across all subjects, then that can give people confidence that politics can be taught in a balanced way. So in terms of what does effective citizenship education look like, I would say that the best models of effective citizenship education are ones where classroom learning, and by classroom learning, I mean learning facts and knowledge from a teacher, are balanced with whole school initiatives that allow young people to practice what they're learning. So that might include student councils, student votes on school rules, even student votes that mimic what's happening in the real world of politics, like mock elections, and beyond that, where students engage in active learning and projects in their communities as well. So we have some really great schools in the UK that do this. So it becomes a very holistic learning journey where the subject goes beyond the walls of the classroom. And those are the most effective ones.
レポートの中で政治家を呼ぶことの大切さも挙げられていたと思うんですけども、政治家を呼ぶってことはなんで大切なんでしょうか？
So politics can seem very distant and remote for young people who only ever get the opportunity to learn it in their classrooms. And actually, politics is a very human endeavor. Think of some of our, some of the great historical writers on democracy and political participation. They don't ever talk about it as something that's only debated within four walls, but something that's acted out in society. And I think where young people get an opportunity to either go to a parliament building and see where laws are made, or get the opportunity to talk to a politician, a legislator in person, then it brings the subject to life for them. It's no longer a set of rules and conventions written down on a page, but it's actually a human endeavor that's practiced by people just like them. And hopefully, on the flip side, what we do then as well is to cultivate political ambition amongst a more diverse segment of the population, so that future politicians are more reflective and representative of the populations they govern.
私は日本で唯一の主権者教育を行う、団体になってしまいました。外部団体はイギリスにおいてどのような役割を果たしていますか？他の団体は資金難で撤退してしまったんですけども、ぜひ弊社にアドバイスをお願いします。
So there are lots of organizations like yours in the UK who are trying to fulfill a similar purpose, which is essentially to plug the gaps in official schooling that we'd wish or we'd like to think should be met by the state. Okay. So there are some big organizations such as the Association for Citizenship Teaching, which is the subject body association for teachers who teach citizenship and anyone else who is interested in it. And they do a huge amount of work in terms of creating resources that they give to schools, providing some guest speakers, providing spaces for professional development for teachers. And then you've got other organizations like Shout Out UK, I already mentioned, who help run the APPG, who deliver their own bespoke courses to schools after and outside the curriculum. You've got organizations like the Politics Project that link up schools with politicians so that they can come in and speak to students. So lots of organizations doing this, and they play a huge, really important role in making sure that young people get some form of citizenship education and politics where it's not happening in a school curriculum. Advice I'd give to you, for the first piece of advice is keep going. You're doing really important work, and it would be a huge shame if you weren't, especially if there are no other organizations doing it in Japan. That means that what you're doing is even more critical. I would suggest that if what you're doing is a dwindling art and these other organizations are disappearing, then it might be worth speaking to organizations in other countries and seeing if you can set up collaborations with them and co-fund one another. It might be that by sharing resources, you're better able to stay afloat and reach a broader audience. I'd keep hammering on the doors of policymakers, because ultimately what you want is for what you're doing to become an official part of education for all young people, or for the government to give you a continued source of funding and support to expand your activities. So try and find the pressure points. Identify when this might be most salient for policymakers, when there's a window of opportunity, and make sure that you've already got conversations set up so they know who you are, you're regularly speaking to them, and they know what you're delivering. And then the final thing I would suggest is that if your civil service, if your government is anything like ours, then the only way that they ever listen to you and they act on what you're saying, or they give you support for what you're doing, is if you have a strong evidence base. So when you're delivering your courses or your sessions to young people, collect data. Get data, more data, even more data, and make sure that you are showing the change that is affected by your intervention. Because if you can provide a government or a civil service with evidence saying, look, before I went into a school, these young people had these particular scores for their how efficacious they felt in their political system, or this much knowledge, or this level of skill, and this is what they were like when I left, and it was so much better. And I've got a big sample of thousands of students, and that's really compelling for a policymaker. So keep going, build collaborations because people are always stronger when they work together. Keep up conversations with policymakers and target windows of opportunity, and continuously evaluate what you're doing so you can show its worth. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you today. Thank you.
最後までご覧いただきありがとうございました。ぜひチャンネル登録、高評価お願いいたします。それではまたごきげんよう。